Welcome to Recovery Services IEP Guidance Document Review. This is an overview presentation for FCPS staff regarding the FCPS guidance for IEP teams for recovery services. This is part 2 of the Recovery Services and Overview for Special Education staff. Please use the guidance document provided to follow along in this presentation. My name is Christina Roman, and I am a Program Manager in the Office of Special Education Procedural Support, and with me today is my colleague, Angelina Prestipino, also a Program Manager in the Office of Special Education Procedural Support. The information in this presentation was adapted from the Virginia Department of Education resource called VDOE Considerations for COVID Recovery Services for Students with Disabilities. The link to the VDOE document is included in the appendices. We will be highlighting information that will help IEP teams begin the conversations on how to determine if recovery services are required, and if so, then how to document those conversations and, if appropriate, services on the IEP. Today's learning objectives are: special education staff will learn how to navigate the FCPS guidance document for IEP teams for COVID recovery services. Special education staff will determine the need for COVID recovery services based on data collected. And special education staff will learn how to document COVID recovery services in the IEP if required. As a reminder from the previous trainings, recovery services are being considered due to the COVID-19 school closure. On page 1 in paragraph 1, we highlighted the salient points for you to consider. Recovery services are additional temporary services required for a student to regain lost skills and fill in gaps where expected progress is not evident, which could include mental health needs related to a student's disability, and are to be considered for any student whose teachers or parents believe the student requires recovery services. On page 1 in paragraph 2, we highlighted the salient points to consider. Not all students with disabilities will require COVID-19 recovery services. The need for COVID recovery services is not limited to academics only. The threat of COVID-19, long-term social distancing, and prolonged disruption to the school routine may create significant stress and impact students' well-being. This is a particularly important consideration for students with disabilities, as they may be more likely to experience challenges in adapting to the many changes brought on by the COVID-19 school closures. Professionals working with students with disabilities need to consider the student's social-emotional needs, as well as the impact that the student's well-being may have on their readiness to learn and make academic progress. And COVID recovery services do not need to be minute-per-minute replacement services. On page 1 in paragraph 3, we continue to talk about recovery services and whether or not they are needed. We will continue to refer to the importance of data. The data and its analysis will be used by IEP teams to determine whether or not a student requires recovery services. We need to remember that prior to determining the need for an amount of COVID recovery services, each IEP team should consider data from a variety of sources. This includes data spanning the continuum of pre-COVID to return to school. Therefore, IEP teams should use individual student progress data and data about FCPS's offerings during COVID closure and upon return to school when considering services. We need to remember that not all students with disabilities will need COVID recovery services. The IEP team will need to determine, if any, the amount and type of recovery services required to address individual students' needs and document the proposal on the IEP. On page 2, you will find a 3-column chart with an analysis. The first column describes the pre-COVID data sources and questions to consider. As you begin to review data, keep in mind that you will need to compare the data from several timeframes. School teams must begin with the data from pre-COVID-19. This will include information from the start of last school year until the closing of schools in March. You will begin by gathering and reviewing data, both formal and informal, from the pre-COVID closure to establish a baseline and compare skills and performance toward IEP goals, review the progress made on IEP goals and objectives, benchmarks to include DRA or iReady, Observations and data from teachers, therapists, parents, and others having direct contact with the student to include screenings, assessments, or any other information maintained on the student, such as pre-tests and post-tests, data from curriculum-based assessments, or any other relevant factors. As you review column 1, you will see some questions to help guide your discussions about the pre-COVID timeframe. The second column describes the COVID-19 school closure data sources and questions to consider. Once you have gathered the pre-COVID data, now you will need to consider the COVID-19 school closure data. As you review column 2, you will see some questions to help guide your discussions on COVID-19 school closure. While teachers did not have to collect data for fourth quarter progress reports or provide grades, teachers should have collected progress monitoring data on the students' participation in distance learning. If the student attended ESY, you want to make sure to review the progress reports and any data or work samples from ESY. It is important to consider the educational model offered to all students by FCPS and whether the student took advantage of this opportunity. Did the parents refuse to send their student? Was the student accessible for instruction and services? How was core content instruction and specialized instruction delivered to students? How was the student's performance during the COVID-19 school closure? You want to make sure to report out on any student data regarding participation, work completion, grades, IEP goals, and parent input. In the third column, the team will consider the virtual return to school and the data gathered through the first quarter up until the date of the IEP meeting. The data points may be similar to the pre-COVID and COVID school closure. However, when you are collecting the data, you will be considering whether they require extensive review to demonstrate previously learned skills, demonstrate inconsistencies in performance, they demonstrate previously mastered or partially required skills presented during pre-COVID closure. Use the folder of information case managers created for each student when discussing the questions, and consider to include attendance and participation.
On this slide, we will focus on page 3 of the document, which shows how to document recovery services on the services page of the IEP. Services should address the instruction specifically related to the student's need for COVID recovery services and should reflect in-person or virtual synchronous instruction provided by a special educator to the student. The hours of services should be determined based on the student's rate of skill acquisition, IEP goal progress, other data that was collected, and the individual student's needs. Just a reminder that the previously proposed IEP services will continue to remain documented in the primary and additional related services sections as appropriate. Click on the drop-down menu and select the service code with an R and indicate the number of hours with start and end dates in that row. For an annual or initial IEP, begin by proposing 5-day in-person services based on 30 hours a week or 120 hours a month in the primary and additional related services sections as appropriate. Propose new hours and dates for virtual and/or face-to-face services according to individual student needs. Then discuss and document recovery services using the drop-down menu and selecting the services coded with an R. All services will continue to run concurrently with regular primary and additional or related services. In the guidance document, you will see additional screenshots of the drop-down menu with the various services for recovery and a PDF, which will show in-person, virtual, and recovery hours in the same grid. The begin date is the date of the IEP meeting, and the service ends on the annual review date. If the date of the recovery service will not start on the day of the IEP meeting, you will need to clearly delineate the start and end dates on the PLOP, services, and in the PWN. After reviewing the data collected through graphs, charts, work samples, grades, as well as other data sources, be sure to include the following information when you're documenting COVID recovery services on the PLOP. a summary of the data used and the discussion held about COVID recovery services, a clearly documented plan for delivering the recovery services to include frequency, location, and duration if different from the services page. A clear start and end date needs to be outlined on the services page. When you are trying to determine the duration of time, you need to take into account the student's stamina to go beyond the school day, the student's schedule, family considerations, local needs, ability to engage in instruction, as examples in the conversation. A plan for monitoring and tracking of the student's progress should also be included. For example, if a student is returning to in-person instruction in January, you may want to deliver those services in person rather than virtually, and you would document that on the plot page. This slide provides a basic example of a statement that could be included on the plot page. Prior to COVID-19, the student was able to, and you would document the skill. During the COVID-19 school closure, he would document the progress he made on that skill. Upon the student's return to school, he would now document what that student is doing with that particular skill. Based on the student's work samples, tests, quizzes, informal assessments, and participation since March 2020, the student requires recovery services because he's not recouped the skills as expected. The student will receive 1 hour a week of math instruction beginning on January 19th, 2021, and ending after 9 weeks on March 23rd, 2021. The student's progress will be assessed at the end of each 4-week interval. At any point, the IEP team can convene to discuss recovery services progress and readjust the plan for the end date based on the data as appropriate. After completing the proposal at the IEP meeting, be sure to include the following information when you are documenting COVID recovery services on the PWN. The school team needs to provide clear descriptions regarding the student's past and current performance, why recovery services are necessary or unnecessary for FAPE in light of the lapse in services caused by COVID-19. The IEP team should clearly identify the rationale behind offering or declining the specified recovery services offered by FCPS. Be sure to include a timeline for when the request for COVID recovery services was made and FCPS's actions taken upon that request. For example, parent requested recovery services in September, and the school team requested to collect data on the student's progress upon the return to school and convene the IEP team and discussion on recovery services at a later time. Now that a full quarter has passed, IEP teams should review the data collected and, if appropriate, schedule an IEP meeting with the parents to discuss recovery services. You may decide to meet as an IEP team and through the conversations decide that you want to continue collecting data before you make a decision. Or the student may be returning to in-person instruction or just have returned and you want to collect additional data. Not all students require recovery services. Teachers should consider the regression that all students may be experiencing and then consider the rate of recoupment of skills for the student with a disability as part of the consideration for the need for recovery services. IEP teams should consider what general education instruction is occurring and what interventions are being implemented for all students. If the student is accessing general education interventions and recouping skills in an expected time frame, then they do not need additional recovery services. Offering recovery services can be more restrictive than having the student access and participate in the general education intervention. If a parent requests an IEP meeting to discuss COVID recovery services, be sure to acknowledge the request within 10 days and schedule an IEP meeting for a mutually agreeable date and time. In this slide, there are some possible options a school team can consider for recovery services. We are looking at creative ways to provide recovery services for students to include before and after school, weekends, or during intervention blocks within the school day. We will be able to compensate staff for their time outside of contract hours. As you consider options for recovery services, it may be appropriate to delay starting services in future months or the summer. For example, the IEP team has agreed to provide recovery services. A parent agrees to math instruction with an in-person home-based instructor for 30 minutes a week for 9 weeks. However, at this time, home-based teachers are not going into student homes. The IEP team agreed that once home-based teachers are able to provide instruction in person, the services will begin. The IEP team believes the student would not benefit from virtual instruction due to screen fatigue. If parents are requesting services from an outside provider or reimbursement for services they provided for their student during an IEP meeting, please let the parent know that their request will be taken into consideration. Review the credentials and the data, and then reach out to your PSL. In your document, you will see a page lists the appendices. Appendix A addresses social emotional learning to include key factors that may affect the whole child, to include their social emotional needs brought on by the COVID-19 school closure. When determining the need for recovery services, we must also consider the student's social emotional needs, as well as the impact that the student's well-being may have on their readiness to learn and make academic progress. Appendix B provides a comparison of recovery and compensatory services. You may have parents who use the words compensatory services in their discussion with you about recovery. We are not considering the determination to be about compensation. Rather, as VDOE stated, this is about a recovery from the COVID-19 forced shutdown of schools and not a denial of faith. Appendix C is a flowchart to guide teams through 4 possible scenarios to consider when determining the need for recovery services in an IEP meeting. If you'll notice in scenario 3, we ask that you go back to an IEP meeting. However, in this scenario, when the student did not attend or participate in any distance learning opportunities offered, that student would likely not meet criteria for recovery services. Please reach out to your PSL if you have questions about this type of scenario. Appendix D is a sample standalone PWN that can be used if the school team refuses to meet at this time to discuss recovery services. This does not mean the team would not meet at a later date, but at this time you do not have enough information to discuss recovery services per a parent request. An example of when this PWN would be appropriate is if the student was not available for learning during the COVID-19 school closure or the return to school. If you continue to need assistance or have questions, please contact the appropriate office listed here. During partial telework status, you may find that an email is the quickest way to receive feedback. There are phone numbers listed, as there are times when the staff are available at the office for phone calls. Thank you for listening to this presentation today.